On the evening of February 7th, 2008, 36-year-old Ben Oxley pulled his truck into the parking lot at the Douglas County Fairgrounds, located near the town of Minden, Nevada, a half an hour east of Lake Tahoe. He killed the engine and then zipped up his jacket, bracing for the windy, cold weather outside. Ben glanced in his rearview mirror, and he saw his 6-year-old daughter, Alyssa, sitting in the back seat. She was bundled up in her winter jacket, and she was grinning ear to ear. Alyssa had been looking forward to this night for weeks. It was the annual pre-Valentine's Day father-daughter dance, where dads brought their daughters to the local fairgrounds for a night of dancing and candy. Ever since Ben and his wife Melissa took Alyssa out shopping for a fancy new dress for this occasion, the dance had become all she could talk about. And Ben had been excited too. He jumped at basically any chance to make special memories with his daughter, especially given the trauma that she had endured over the past few years. He felt a pang of guilt just thinking about it. Ben's relationship with Alyssa's mother, Dawn, had always been rocky. They were divorced, but during their marriage and after, they had fought constantly. They had also both cheated on each other. Ben was short-tempered and angry while they were together, and even though they had broken up when Alyssa was just a toddler, he feared that relationship and its fallout had done lasting damage. They had shared custody of Alyssa for a while, but Dawn was a drinker, and Ben suspected she was also using other drugs. She also brought sketchy people home with her, and she was always broke with 100 excuses about why she couldn't hold a job. Ben felt like Dawn always blamed everybody else for all her problems, which was yet another thing that just drove him crazy. So, a few years ago, he decided to just file for sole custody of Alyssa. It had been a very ugly court battle, but the judge ultimately ruled in his favor. And so Ben, after taking custody of Alyssa, had worked hard to make her life as stable as possible, even though he knew, every other weekend his daughter would go and see Dawn, and he really had no control over how that interaction went. But for now, Ben just pushed the thought of his ex-wife out of his head, and he stepped out of his truck. Then he opened up the passenger door and held his hand out for Alyssa, helping her climb out of the truck without getting dust on her brand new beautiful dress. The father and daughter followed the sound of the loud music across the parking lot and into the fairgrounds event building. Once inside, they found a very crowded party. Alyssa immediately saw a few friends waving at her from the dance floor, and so Ben helped her out of her winter coat and then watched as she went running across the room to say hello. Ben smiled to himself. He knew the drill with these father-daughter dances. Alyssa would run around with her friends for a few hours before eventually, right at the end, finding him for just the final dance of the night. That was it. But even though he really didn't see his daughter much during this dance, for him, as long as Alyssa was happy, he was happy. And in fact, Alyssa really did seem to be doing quite well these days. I mean, during the custody battle, she was very unhappy. And then initially, when Ben had begun dating his current wife, Melissa, Alyssa was, she was 2 years old, but she just didn't really like Melissa. But eventually she had adjusted to her and seemed to really like her. And, when he and Melissa got married a little over a year ago, nobody was happier about it than Alyssa, which had been a huge relief. And so now he's looking out, seeing his daughter, and it just seemed like she was super well adjusted and living her best life. And so Ben made his way over to the snack table and poured himself a glass of punch. Then he wandered over to a table full of other dads, and he sat down in one of the folding chairs and started chatting. A few hours later, the DJ came over the speaker and announced that it was going to be the last song of the night. And sure enough, Alyssa came running around the corner to find her dad. Ben took his daughter out onto the dance floor and twirled her around as the first notes of a song called Butterfly Kisses came on, which just so happened to be their special song. Ben tried his best to soak in every second of the dance. It had been a long road to get to a night like this. A couple weeks later, on the evening of Wednesday, February 20th, Ben cleared dinner plates from the dining room table while his daughter Alyssa, his wife Melissa, and Melissa's teenage brother Craig sat down in the living room to watch a movie. Craig had come to live with them a few weeks ago. His mother's new boyfriend had moved into his house, and Craig didn't like the boyfriend very much, so here he was. And for the most part, Craig fit right in, so his presence in the house really was not a big deal. Grocery bills had gotten more expensive, and the house was definitely more crowded, but these were minor inconveniences, and Ben was happy to give Craig a comfortable place to live. Ben set the dinner dishes in the sink, grabbed a bag of candy, and made his way into the living room where he sat down beside his wife. She had the movie queued up, and she rested her head on his shoulder and then hit play. And within minutes, Ben heard a quiet snore and knew that Melissa had fallen asleep. Ben passed the candy bag over to Craig and Alyssa for them to share, and then the family settled in for the movie. By the time it was over, only Ben and his daughter were the ones left awake. Ben sent Alyssa off to brush her teeth, then slowly he got up from the couch, trying hard not to wake up his wife. He guided her head down onto a pillow and then grabbed a blanket and put it over her. Craig was asleep on the other end of the couch, so Ben threw a blanket on him too. Then he turned off the TV and quietly made his way to the back of the house to tuck his daughter into bed. A few hours later, Ben's wife Melissa woke up in a panic, feeling totally disoriented and convinced she was late for work. It took her a minute to even realize she was on the couch in her living room, and then she looked up at the clock above the mantel and saw it was only 2:30 in the morning. And so she realized she must have fallen asleep during the movie again. She looked down at the other end of the couch and saw there was just a crumpled blanket where Craig must have been sitting. He must have fallen asleep too, but at some point before her, woke up and went to his own bed. Melissa rolled off the couch and then headed to the back bedroom, where she crawled into bed next to Ben, who was already fast asleep. And it felt like she had only just dozed off when suddenly there was this ear-splitting loud bang that ripped her from her sleep. Her ears were ringing and she was totally disoriented. She had no idea what it was. And so confused, she rolled over and tried to shake Ben awake, but he was fast asleep. And so she just pulled herself out of bed and went to go investigate the noise herself. As she walked out into the hall, she looked over at the nightstand and saw the clock said 3:30 a.m. So she'd only been asleep for maybe an hour. Once she was out in the hallway, she began walking around looking for Craig or Alyssa, but the house seemed empty. But at the end of the hallway, she felt this rush of cold wind, and she looked up and saw the front door was wide open, letting all the winter air blow in. And at that point, Melissa froze. Someone clearly had been inside their home. Terrified, she turned around and ran back to the back bedroom. She flipped on the light and was about to tell Ben to wake up, somebody's broken in, when she stopped. Because now with the lights on, she could see the bed sheets were soaked with blood. Melissa called 911, and within minutes, 2 officers from the Douglas County Sheriff's Department pulled up in front of their home, which was a ranch out in rural Nevada. The officers stepped out of the cruiser with their guns drawn. They knew they were about to walk into an active crime scene, and there was a chance the perpetrator could still be on the premises. One officer pointed his flashlight and gun towards the house, illuminating the front door, which was wide open. He looked over at his partner. Dispatch had told them backup was on the way, but there was also an injured man inside this house. They couldn't wait for more officers to get here. They had to act now. So they moved towards the house. Once inside, they entered the living room, and it was dark, and there was no one in there. They turned into the hallway and made their way down until they stopped outside of a closed door on their immediate right. One of the officers let it swing open. They looked inside and shined their flashlights, and they could see it was a bedroom. In the beam of one of their flashlights, they could see that there was somebody hiding beneath a pile of covers on the bed. The officers shouted out, "Police!" and ordered the person to come out with their hands up, but the bundle of covers didn't move. The officers then heard ragged breathing coming from beneath the blankets. Slowly, they approached the bed and yanked off the covers, and the teenage boy whipped his hands into the air, visibly shaking as he screamed out that his name was Craig Nichols and he lived here. One of the officers told Craig to stay put. Then he told his partner to stay with Craig as he continued to go search the rest of the house. Back out in the hallway, that officer was about to continue his scan of the property when he turned and he nearly fell over when he saw this woman come barging out of a back bedroom, soaked in blood, and she was holding hands with this little girl who was sobbing to herself. The woman looked completely panicked, and she turned and saw the officer, and she could barely speak, but she just said, "My husband's in there," pointing to the bedroom, and she said he's badly injured. The officer nodded and realized this must be the woman who called 911, and so he rushed past her and the little girl and made his way into the back bedroom. But the second he looked down onto that bed, he knew this woman's husband was not just badly injured. This man was dead. 15 minutes later, Sergeant Ron Elges of the Douglas County Sheriff's Department stepped through the door of the small ranch home, which was now lit up outside with blue and red police lights, and inside with every light switch in the house flipped on. Crime scene techs were beginning to file in, and uniformed officers outside were keeping all the neighbors back. One of the first responding officers came to meet Sergeant Elges in the kitchen. He told him that a man named Ben Oxley was the deceased man in the back bedroom. He'd been shot in the head while he was asleep next to his wife Melissa, who had called 911. When the responding officer and his partner arrived, he said the front door of the house was wide open, and the only people inside the house were Melissa, her 16-year-old brother Craig, and her 6-year-old stepdaughter. And none of them said they saw or heard anything except for the 6-year-old. She said that she had heard floorboards creaking and had seen a shadow. The officer also said there was no sign of forced entry and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Elges nodded and thanked the officer for the info. Then he strode down the hallway to the back bedroom. Ben's body was still in the bed. Elges stepped closer to get a better look at the blood spatter on the sheets, and he noticed little pellets scattered all across the bed, which he immediately recognized as the remnants of a shotgun blast. But beyond the bed being just a grisly mess, nothing else in the bedroom was out of place. The killer had clearly snuck into the bedroom, taken their shot, and fled. Elges left the bedroom and went over to where Melissa was sitting on the couch in the living room, draped in a blanket and crying. The little girl was sitting next to her, looking terrified and confused. Elges wanted to speak to Melissa, but before he did, just by looking at her, he noticed something strange. Melissa had said she had been asleep next to Ben when he was killed, but she had no injuries, despite the fact that shotgun pellets had clearly sprayed across the bed. I mean, a shotgun is more of an area weapon. It fires in more than one direction. And interestingly, there really wasn't any blood spatter on her, not on her face, not on her clothes. She's laying next to her husband when he's shot with a shotgun. You would think blood would spatter all over her. And she did have blood on her, quite a bit, on her hands and arms, but it looked like it got there from her touching her husband after the fact. Just then, an investigator tapped Elges on the shoulder and let him know that they had found shotgun shells on a dresser in Craig's bedroom, as well as 2 actual shotguns in the garage, and that Craig, the 16-year-old, had said they were his. Elges glanced down at Melissa again, and then over towards Craig, who was sitting on his bed talking to an investigator. Then he looked at Alyssa, and he saw she was crying. As far as he was concerned, this little girl was the only certain victim here this evening. Melissa and Craig, on the other hand, he wasn't so sure. To him, this was clearly a murder committed by someone who knew Ben. After all, there was no attempt to rob the place, no sign of forced entry either, which meant whoever shot Ben either had access to the house or was already inside. Before leaving, Elges asked some of the officers to canvass the neighborhood to see if anybody had seen or heard anything suspicious. And then he told Craig and Melissa to get themselves organized because when they were ready, he wanted to see them down at the station for questioning. An hour later, Elges walked into an interview room at the Douglas County Sheriff's Department. Melissa was already sitting at a table waiting for him. Her face was red and puffy, and she was disheveled. She looked very distraught, and the moment she laid eyes on Elges, she just started bawling. Elges sat down in a chair next to her and pressed record on the tape player between them on the table. Then he told Melissa that he understood how difficult his request was going to be, but he needed her to walk him through what happened that night, step by step. And he needed to get her whole story on tape because he needed to clear her as a suspect. Melissa gasped and grabbed a tissue from the box on the interview table. It seemed like the idea of her being a suspect had sent her into a new wave of sadness, and it took her a few minutes before she was calm enough to even speak. When she finally began rehashing all the details of the night, her voice was very shaky, and Elges couldn't help but feel like her grief seemed very sincere. But it was also hard to ignore the fact that if she was lying next to her husband when he was shot, she really should have had blood spatter all over her. And she should have been hurt by at least 1 or 2 of the shotgun pellets. And yet she had walked away with virtually no blood spatter and unhurt. And so Elges actually brought this up to Melissa. He said, "I think it's odd that these things are not here." And he watched for any signs of defensiveness in her response. But Melissa just shrugged and agreed that, yeah, it was strange. She must have just gotten very lucky or something. Elges nodded, but he was not necessarily convinced. And so he changed tactics, and he asked Melissa whether she knew if Ben had any enemies who might want to hurt him. Melissa sighed and explained that Alyssa's mother, Dawn, was a total nightmare, and she had some awful friends that Ben had fought with her about. Melissa said she and Ben barely let Alyssa spend any time at Dawn's house because Dawn's general lifestyle felt literally too dangerous for a small girl to be around. That information piqued Elge's interest, and so he knew one of his very next steps was going to be tracking down and speaking with Dawn. If Melissa was painting an accurate picture of her, Dawn could be a viable suspect. At that point, Elge stopped the tape recorder and told Melissa to hang tight. He might have other questions as the morning unfolded. Melissa nodded and took another tissue. Back in the hallway, an officer waved Elge down and handed him a report. Forensics had done a preliminary analysis of the shotgun pellets that they'd collected from the scene, and they were a match for number 8 birdshot shells, which was the exact kind of shells that had been found in Craig's room. Elge raised his eyebrows. Then he thanked the officer and walked straight into the interview room next to Melissa's. This is where Craig was waiting. And only 15 minutes into the interview with Craig, Elge was even more suspicious of Craig. He answered every question with unnerving calm, like this was just a casual conversation, not an interview about a murder case. And so at some point, Elge just asked him point blank, did he kill Ben Oxley? Craig was quick to say no, and so Elge asked him if he would submit to a polygraph test. Craig said of course, whatever he could do to help, but he still looked weirdly calm. That is, until Elge stood up to go arrange for this lie detector test, at which point Craig's face suddenly crumpled and a loud sob escaped his mouth, and he burst into tears. The sudden flip of emotions really caught Elge off guard, and instinctively he walked over and offered Craig a tissue. Now, Elge was not about to dismiss Craig as a suspect just because now he seemed to be having a more natural reaction to the death of a family member, especially when you considered the fact that there were number 8 shells found in Craig's room, the same type that were used to kill Ben. But for some reason, Craig's outbreak of emotion here made Elge less convinced that this guy could be their killer. Elge told Craig to stay put for a while. He wanted he and his sister to just stay at the station for the time being. Soon, forensics would come back with the results of a gunshot residue test. They had conducted it on Craig and Melissa when they first arrived, and it would tell them whether or not either of them had fired a shotgun in the last 24 hours. While Elge waited for these results, he left the interview room to go grab a cup of coffee. He wanted to be on high alert when he met the next person he was bringing down to the station. Elge was just finishing his first cup of coffee and about to pour a second one when a uniformed officer ducked her head into the break room and told him that Dawn, Ben's ex-wife, had just shown up. The officer also told Elge that Dawn was aware that Ben was dead, and there was also one other thing that Elge should know. And that was that a year ago, after a judge had given Ben full custody of his and Dawn's daughter, that he and Dawn had gotten into a physical fight. The cops were called, and they wrote up the incident as mutual domestic battery. No charges were filed, but still, their divorce was clearly a very messy one. Elge nodded, left his coffee cup on the counter, and strode down the hallway toward interview room number 3. The second Elge stepped inside the room, he smelled alcohol. Dawn was bleary-eyed, and her hair and clothes were disheveled. She looked up at him and made this joke that she felt like she was in a cop show on TV. Elge didn't react and just sat down across from her. But before he could ask her any questions, she just went off on Ben, saying what a bad guy he was and all these fights they'd gotten into, and Elge began to think she must be drunk. It took him a few tries to get her quiet long enough to actually start their interview. However, once he got her to settle down, he was able to ask her what she'd been up to that night. Dawn began scratching her head and suddenly acting really cagey. She said that she was at home with her teenage kids, Devin and Brandy, and also their family friend, a 21-year-old named James Matleen. Dawn said she was good friends with James's mom, and James was almost like her surrogate kid. Dawn said they had all watched a couple of movies together before falling asleep around maybe 4 a.m, and that none of them ever left the house. Elge smiled and told Dawn that was good. Everyone was accounted for. But Dawn didn't seem to be listening to him. She just started asking if Ben was really dead, over and over and over, until she got so worked up she started to cry. Finally, Elge just shut off the recorder and told Dawn she was free to go. She nodded and fumbled with her purse for a while and slowly made her way out of the room. Dawn seemed like a mess, like somebody who would not have been capable of sneaking into somebody's house and shooting them only a few hours earlier. Elgis stepped out of the room, and a detective met him in the hallway to tell him that the gunshot residue test results on Craig and Melissa were back. Craig's hands were clean, meaning there was no way he could have fired a gun that night. But Melissa did have some residue on her. Now, that could be because she was sleeping next to Ben when he was shot, but it could also be because she was the one who shot him. Elgis thanked the detective, then just stood there thinking. The way Elgis saw it, he had two compelling suspects. Melissa, who he just found out had gunshot residue on her, yet was strangely uninjured and didn't have blood spatter on her, and she was right next to Ben when he was killed. And Dawn, the ex-wife, who was this erratic, spiteful mess. He was fairly confident that Craig was not involved, and it was more likely that maybe Melissa stole his ammunition out of his room. But right now, Elgis was exhausted. He'd been up all night, and he knew he would be useless to this case if he didn't get some sleep. So he told the other investigators that he was going home for a nap. Then he would come back and look at the case with fresh eyes. The following day, on Friday, Elgis was back at his desk at the sheriff's department, sorting through a pile of notes and reports on Ben's case. He still liked Melissa or Dawn for this murder, and he had been hoping that the forensics team might be able to provide more evidence that would help guide his investigation. But the preliminary medical examiner's report had come back, and it only confirmed what Elgis already knew. Ben was killed with a shotgun at close range using a number 8 birdshot shell. Now, this was, of course, the same kind of ammo that was found in Craig's room, but the crime scene tech said that was not really actually incriminating. Number 8 birdshots were common ammunition for this part of Nevada, so it made sense that Craig might have a few rounds. Plus, neither of the shotguns that were found in Ben's garage had been fired recently, which meant that neither of them could be the murder weapon. And beyond that, there just hadn't been much evidence at all at the scene. Elgis' team had canvassed Ben and Melissa's neighborhood, but none of the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. Officers also interviewed dozens of friends and family members, hoping to drum up some leads, but one after another, the only things people had to say were about what a great guy Ben was. And it looked like Dawn's alibi was going to check out. Another detective had spoken to James Matleen, the family friend who was watching movies with Dawn and her teenage kids on the night Ben was killed, and he corroborated her story. Her kids did too. They had watched 2 action movies, then passed out sometime around 4 a.m. Elgis sighed, feeling stuck. He glanced over at his phone and saw he had a new voicemail. He put the phone to his ear. It was an insurance company, letting Elgis know that they had some information he might find interesting. Ben had a $400,000 life insurance policy, and Melissa was the sole beneficiary. Now, this life insurance policy was not very new, and Melissa had been the beneficiary since the two got married. So this was not enough to bring her back down to the station for more questions, but still, it was all Elgis really had, so he decided to keep a close eye on her. But over the next few days, Elgis and his team struggled to find any further evidence that incriminated Melissa or anybody else. And so to help the investigation along, the Douglas County Sheriff's Department set up a secret witness reward that guaranteed $12,500 to anyone who came forward with information that led to an arrest. But still, no solid leads came through. The following week, on March 7th, so 15 days after the murder, Melissa and the rest of her family held a memorial service for Ben, and more than 400 people came to pay their respects. And for Elgis, this confirmed what Ben's family had told him all along, that Ben truly was beloved. In the weeks that followed, that secret witness fund grew to over $22,000, and Ben's sister traveled all over Nevada hanging up posters to advertise the reward. But as weeks turned to months, the tip line stayed quiet and the case stalled out. Detective Elgis was out of leads and desperate. And then, one hot morning in June, he heard a rumor that piqued his interest. Ben had only been dead for 4 months, but Melissa had already begun dating again. In Elgis' opinion, this seemed pretty quick to move on, especially after your husband was murdered literally next to you in bed. Elgis thought of the $400,000 life insurance payout that Melissa now had coming, and suddenly he wondered if it might be time to bring her back down to the station after all. But a few days later, Elgis sat at his paper-strewn desk, staring down unhappily at the results from a polygraph test that he'd administered to Melissa. Now, polygraphs are not 100% reliable, so they're typically not admissible in court. But still, Elgis had sort of hoped that Melissa might fail her test when she was asked about Ben and the insurance money. But instead, Melissa had passed the test with flying colors. There was no deception detected. And so Elgis was beginning to fear that this case was going to go completely cold. But just then, Elgis's phone rang. It was another sergeant from his department, and he told Elgis they had been going back through some of the evidence in Ben's case with fresh eyes, specifically some security footage from businesses near Ben's home. And they had found something they missed the first time, and they had just emailed it to him. Elgis sat up in his chair, suddenly very alert. He thanked the sergeant and hung up, and then eagerly opened up his email. The footage he received was from a security camera in a 7-Eleven convenience store from around 1:30 in the morning on February 21st, so about 2 hours before Ben was murdered. In the footage, a person walked into the store with a baseball cap pulled down over their face, and they went up to the counter. And despite the hat on this person, Elgis realized he recognized the person he was looking at. And with this, after months of stall-out, he had a stunning new lead. He realized that all this time, someone he had spoken to during the investigation, that really he hadn't considered a suspect at all, had been lying to him. It would still take another full year and a risky plea deal to prove his theory, but finally, Sergeant Elgis knew what happened to Ben Oxley. Based on evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews collected over the course of 18 months, this is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Ben Oxley in the early hours of February 21st, 2008. It was just after 3 in the morning. The killers slowly made their way through the Oxley house, down the hallway, towards the primary bedroom and back. They made their way into the room, and they walked over to Ben's side of the bed. There they looked down, and they saw him fast asleep. They raised their shotgun. Their plan was to kill Ben and then flee. But as they stood there with their shotgun raised right at his face, ready to fire, their conscience stopped them. Suddenly they thought to themselves, "What am I doing?" The killer just stood there, frozen. And that's when they heard a creak coming from the hallway right behind them, right outside of the kids' bedrooms. And the sound actually spooked them so badly that they jumped, accidentally squeezing the trigger, killing Ben instantly. At this point, the killer panicked and ran out of the bedroom, down the hallway, and out the front door, leaving it wide open behind them. They jumped into their truck and they drove away. It would turn out the killer was someone the police had spoken to early in the investigation, but they did not initially see them as a suspect. That is, until they discovered that 7-Eleven video surveillance footage, which showed the young man who Ben's ex-wife, Dawn Oxley, had claimed was just her family friend, James Matleen. The police had not suspected James, because they didn't think he had any connection to Ben or a motive to kill him. What they didn't know was that he and Dawn were actually romantically involved. And because Dawn hated Ben so much, James decided he too hated Ben. But even knowing this, police couldn't prove that James killed Ben until November of 2009, because that was when Dawn got arrested for driving under the influence, and prosecutors offered her immunity on the drunk driving charge in exchange for her testimony about James, and she took it. She told them James was the killer. It was not until police arrested James that a much more full version of the story finally came out. James told police that it was true, he did kill Ben. But he also told them that he only did it because Dawn wanted him to. Apparently, she still blamed Ben for losing custody of her daughter, Alyssa. James told police that Dawn actually went into the house with him that night to show him where Ben slept. He said it was Dawn, not him, that Alyssa saw standing outside of her bedroom door right before the shotgun blast, the so-called shadow she told police about. However, by the time the police learned this version of events, it was too late to charge Dawn with any crimes at all. They had already given her immunity in exchange for her statement. On March 16, 2012, a little more than 4 years after the murder, James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Dawn, who may have been the mastermind of a crime that she never did time for, she died at the age of 50 in the year 2022. On the morning of Friday, October 29, 1948, a young woman named Helen Stack woke up inside her modest home in the small town of Donora, Pennsylvania. And as soon as Helen opened her eyes, she started coughing. Her throat had been sore for a few days, but this morning it felt even worse. She thought she might be coming down with a cold, but Helen was not the kind of person to let a minor illness slow her down. So she still got out of bed, got dressed, and then drank some coffee and ate breakfast before starting her walk to work. From where her house stood near the top of a hill, Helen could sometimes see the entire town. Donora sat inside of a valley right on the banks of the Monongahela River, surrounded on three sides by 400-foot-tall cliffs. On the fourth side were rolling hills that stretched off into the distance. That morning, though, Helen couldn't see any of Donora's natural beauty, because fog was blocking her view. In fact, low gray clouds had been hanging over the town for the past 4 days. But that was actually normal, because Donora was inside of basically a natural bowl in the earth. The surrounding cliffs and hills blocked the wind, so the fog would accumulate and then get stuck in the valley. To Helen, this was just part of life in Donora. And while it was sort of frustrating at times, it was easy to ignore, because there were so many other good things about living there. Everybody was friendly, there were plenty of jobs, and there were always fun events going on. As she walked to work, Helen could hardly see across the street, but she could see enough in front of her to say hello to the neighbors who passed her by on her side of the sidewalk, who all knew her by name. And then at some point she passed by a street next to a bunch of industrial mills that were also shrouded in fog, and she knew that somewhere in that fog, most of the men in Donora were working. And when she reached McKean Avenue, the main street in town, she could barely make out the workers who were hanging up decorations for that evening's annual Halloween parade. Eventually, Helen came to a stop in front of a tall brownstone building on McKean Avenue. She went inside, walked up to the second floor, and unlocked the door of the doctor's office where she worked. Helen was the only employee working for the two doctors, Ralph Kohler and Edward Roth. To Helen, these two men seemed pretty similar. Both were in their 40s, they were tall and heavy-set, and they both had very kind and patient demeanors. The only obvious difference between them was that Dr. Roth smoked cigars like a chimney, and Dr. Kohler avoided cigars altogether because he had diabetes and a heart condition. As for Helen, she was a receptionist, a secretary, and a nurse, so she had a lot of responsibilities at the office. And today, like most days, she was the first one to the office. She turned on the lights and opened up the blinds in the waiting room, then began sweeping up the thin layer of soot that had blown in through the air vents and settled on the floor overnight. Like the fog in Donora, the soot was also very annoying, but totally normal to Helen. She knew it came from the mills nearby. It was just a normal part of living in a factory town inside of a valley. After Helen was all done cleaning up the waiting room, she looked around and smiled, because she had just enough time to go smoke a cigarette before the doctors came in and patients began to arrive. Helen sat down behind the reception desk and lit her cigarette. She took a long drag, but immediately she noticed it had a strange bittersweet taste to it. She tried again, and suddenly the tobacco tasted so awful that she doubled over coughing. She coughed until she had tears in her eyes, but she wasn't sure if it was from the cigarette, her sore throat, or maybe both. Either way, Helen stubbed out the half-smoked cigarette into her ashtray, and then she heard the door open. She looked up to see Dr. Kohler walking inside, and so she knew her workday was about to begin. A few hours later, at 3 p.m., Dr. Kohler stood in the back of the doctor's office and pulled on his overcoat. Even though it was only mid-afternoon, he already felt exhausted. His diabetes and his heart condition left him chronically tired, and to deal with it, he kept to a very specific schedule. He went home every day at precisely 3 p.m. so he could lay down and rest before dinner. But right when he was about to leave, he heard quick footsteps coming down the hallway, and Helen rounded the corner. She looked concerned and said an older man had just come in, wheezing and complaining that he couldn't catch his breath. Dr. Kohler knew he needed to get home for his own sake, but his partner, Dr. Roth, had already gone on a break, and he couldn't just turn away a patient who needed help. So he took off his overcoat and told Helen to bring the patient back to an exam room. Moments later, Dr. Kohler met that patient in the exam room, and he recognized him as one of his regulars. The man was one of many locals in town who Dr. Kohler treated for asthma, which is a chronic condition that causes a person's airways to swell and make it difficult to breathe. And so as a result, Dr. Kohler wasn't surprised that this patient was wheezing. Whenever the fog in Donora got really thick, people's asthma tended to flare up. So Dr. Kohler gave his patient the usual asthma treatment for 1948, which was a shot of adrenaline. Adrenaline is a hormone that can help open a person's airway when they're having trouble breathing. Once the adrenaline shot took effect and the man caught his breath again, Dr. Kohler sent him on his way. Then the doctor put his overcoat back on and followed that patient out, anxious to go home and get in bed. "30 minutes later, Helen sat at the reception desk and flicked through the day's mail. Usually, the office got quiet in the afternoons, and then business would pick up again in the evenings. So she was using the lull to get some administrative work done. Helen pulled out the junk mail from the pile and then got up to throw it away. But as she was walking towards the trash can, she heard a loud crash from the hallway outside the office, followed by the sound of somebody yelling. Helen's first thought was somebody fell down the stairs, and so she rushed to check if they were okay, and what she saw in the hallway absolutely terrified her. A man she didn't recognize was clinging to the banister, and his knuckles were white and his face was turning blue. He was moaning in pain, kicking the wall and screaming, "Help me! Help me! I'm dying!" Helen was so confused and afraid that she just froze. Luckily, another doctor who ran his own private practice across the hall from them soon showed up, and so did the other doctor that Helen worked for, Dr. Roth. While those two doctors began to help the man, Helen heard the sound of her phone ringing at her reception desk. And so Helen kind of broke out of her trance, ran back inside the office and answered the phone, and immediately she heard the sound of a woman screaming on the other end of the line for help, just like the blue-faced man in the hall had been doing. The woman said her husband couldn't breathe and he needed help right now. Helen got the woman's address and promised that Dr. Roth would be there soon. However, before Helen could run across the hall and tell Dr. Roth that another patient needed his help, the phone rang again, and then again, and then again. And everyone Helen spoke to said the same thing. They couldn't breathe, they were coughing up blood, their heads hurt, their stomachs were killing them, and they all thought they were going to die. And unfortunately, the town only had a single ambulance, and it was booked solid. And so one after another, Helen took down these people's names and addresses and added them to the growing list of patients the doctors needed to visit. Helen had no idea what was going on in Donora, but it certainly felt like all hell had broken loose inside of her normally quiet town. Two hours later, at 6 p.m., Dr. Roth squinted as he very slowly drove down McKean Avenue after an afternoon of house calls. Because of the fog, which now had gotten so bad, he could hardly make out the lines on the road, and so he just gripped the steering wheel tightly and went really slow, keeping an eye out for the brownstone building where he worked. Dr. Roth had never been in a situation like this before. People all over town were struggling to breathe, regardless of whether they had asthma or not, and Dr. Roth really didn't know why. He figured it must be something in the air, literally, but even with fog this bad, he'd never seen it affect people this much before. By this point in the day, he'd already given so many patients adrenaline injections that he'd run through his entire supply, and he'd barely made a dent in the list of people who still needed help. And so now he needed to stop by the office and refill his supply of adrenaline before making more house calls. But it was literally too foggy to even find his own address. And so Dr. Roth figured he'd have better luck if he just parked his car and walked. So he carefully pulled to the curb, turned off the engine, and got out. He went to the sidewalk, and when he saw the nearest building to him, he realized he'd actually driven past his office without knowing it. And so Dr. Roth doubled back towards the brownstone, threw open the door, and began running up the stairs. However, after only a few steps, he had to stop because he ran out of breath, and then he began to cough. His chest felt tight, like somebody was squeezing the air out of him. He managed to make it back to his office, but immediately when he got there, he doubled over in the entryway and coughed until tears were streaming down his face. Dr. Roth felt like he was choking. He started to panic and looked around for help, but his secretary, Helen, had left for dinner, and his colleague, Dr. Kohler, who had left to go take a nap, was still at home. Dr. Roth realized he was all alone in his office. He held onto a desk and tried to steady himself,
but he kept hacking until he felt nauseous. He managed to make it to the bathroom before he actually vomited. And then after that, he stumbled to the bathroom sink and splashed cold water on his face. His heart was racing and his whole body felt weak, but he knew he couldn't just stand there because he still felt faint. So he rushed towards the back room where drugs were stored and grabbed a vial of adrenaline and a clean syringe. With his hands shaking, Dr. Roth filled the syringe, poked the needle through his pant leg into his thigh, and injected himself with adrenaline. And after that, he just collapsed into his office chair. After a few moments, Dr. Roth took a big, deep breath. He sat there for several minutes, relishing how good it felt to breathe again. And as he slowly calmed back down, Dr. Roth tried to figure out what had just happened to him. Just like the patients he'd been visiting all day, he'd had what seemed like a sudden, very severe asthma attack. But why? He felt sure that something in the air, in the fog, was causing people all over town, including him, to nearly suffocate. But what? Fog was normal in Denora, so what was different about it this time? As he was thinking it over, Dr. Roth opened up a drawer in his desk, and out of pure habit, he grabbed a cigar. Without thinking, he struck a match, lit the cigar, and took a puff. And immediately, he launched into another uncontrollable coughing fit. Meanwhile, Helen was on her way back to work after her dinner break. She walked through the fog and past a crowd of people gathered on McKean Avenue. There were adults and kids, all dressed up in festive costumes. Helen knew they were all waiting for the annual Halloween parade to begin. But she couldn't think about candy and costumes right now. She was too preoccupied with getting back to work and making sure her patients were okay. She soon made it to the brownstone and went upstairs to the doctor's office. And right when she opened the door, she heard the phone ring. But before she could answer it, she heard something else. There was a groaning sound coming from the back hallway. It made the hair on the back of Helen's neck stand up, because Dr. Kohler and Dr. Roth were supposed to be at home on their dinner breaks. Helen should have been alone at the office. She followed the groaning sound back to Dr. Roth's private office, and she opened the door to find one of her bosses slumped in his chair. His face was bright red and drenched in sweat, he was wheezing, and his eyes were huge and terrified. But somehow, Dr. Roth spoke, and he told Helen he was okay. He just needed to catch his breath. Helen did not believe him. But she could still hear the phone ringing, and Dr. Roth told her to just go answer it. And so perhaps against her better judgment, she turned and left, and when she got back into the waiting room to answer the phone, she now saw there were a few patients that had come inside. She gestured to let them know she'd be with them in a second, and then she answered the phone. But this time, Helen didn't hear a patient begging for help. She heard her other boss, Dr. Kohler, and his voice sounded strained. He said that ever since he had left the office earlier that afternoon, he'd been struggling to breathe too, and he said he didn't know when he'd be able to come back to work. Helen said okay, but it really was not okay, because as she stood there holding the phone to her ear, the office door swung open and more coughing, wheezing patients tumbled inside. Helen felt so confused and helpless. Half the town was outside enjoying the Halloween parade, totally oblivious to what was happening. Meanwhile, the phone wouldn't stop ringing and patients were flooding into the doctor's office one after another. And the doctors, Dr. Kohler and Dr. Roth, were both deathly ill, and no one actually knew what was causing any of this. Helen felt like she had no choice but to close the office, because there was nothing Dr. Kohler or Dr. Roth could do for anybody. So she hung up the phone and turned around and told the patients gathered in the waiting room that she was very sorry, but they would have to leave and go to a different doctor's office for help. About 7 hours later, a man named Rudolf Schwerha was lying in bed with his wife. They were both fast asleep until the sound of the phone ringing jolted them awake. Rudolf rolled over, looked at the clock on his bedside table, and sighed. It was 2 a.m., which meant the call could not be good news. And that was because Rudolf was both a mortician and the county coroner. He lived right above the funeral home that he owned and operated, and he only got calls in the middle of the night if somebody had died. Rudolf picked up the phone and said hello, and sure enough, the woman on the other end, a dispatcher at the local sheriff's office, said a 70-year-old man had passed away about half an hour earlier. She said he'd suddenly developed severe respiratory symptoms and stopped breathing. Rudolph did not ask any follow-up questions because it was 2 a.m. and he wasn't really thinking straight, and also because he was totally unaware of the mysterious illness currently plaguing Denora. He just asked the woman for the address, and then said he would send his hearse to pick up the man's remains. Rudolph then called his hearse driver and explained the situation, and the driver said he was on it and would bring the remains back to the funeral home soon. Rudolph hung up, and while his wife went back to sleep, he laid there, awake in bed, and listened for the sound of the hearse pulling into his driveway. He figured the driver would show up within minutes because the address was only 2 blocks away. But half an hour passed by before Rudolph finally heard a car's engine rumbling outside. Rudolph was about to get up to go greet the driver, but as soon as he threw back the covers, his phone rang again. And again, it's the middle of the night, and so these calls are not good news. Rudolph noticed his wife had just woken up, and she sat up next to him, looking confused. Rudolph picked up the phone and said hello, and he was surprised to hear that another person had passed away. And like the first, they'd suddenly developed severe breathing problems and then just died. 2 deaths within an hour of each other was unusual in a town as small as Denora, and it was even more strange for 2 people to just suddenly stop breathing. Rudolph didn't know what was going on, but now he felt uneasy, and he decided he should go with his driver to the next address. So Rudolph told his wife he'd be back soon, then he got dressed and hurried outside. A few minutes later, Rudolph rode in the passenger seat while his hearse driver inched down the street. It had taken the driver so long to get to the funeral home because the fog outside had somehow gotten even worse. It was like a solid gray wall. As the driver slowly inched forward, Rudolph stared intently out the windshield, desperately trying to somehow see through the fog. They were headed to a neighborhood on the opposite side of the Monongahela River, and to get there, they would have to drive across a very thin road right next to a cliff. And so Rudolph, naturally, was very concerned that they might accidentally drive right off of it. So when they neared the cliff, Rudolph told the driver to stop and said he wanted to drive, but he would still need the driver's help. While Rudolph got behind the wheel of the hearse, the driver got outside and stood in front of the car. Then he used a flashlight to guide Rudolph through the fog and make sure the car didn't slip off the side of the cliff. And so Rudolph gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles and did his best to drive as carefully as he could. He knew they would only need to cover a very short distance, but every inch on that cliff felt like torture. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they made it past the cliff and into the neighborhood. They picked up the deceased person's body and then turned right back around and did the same process of slowly driving past the cliff, and then finally, once they were on the other side, they headed back to the funeral home. And by the time they finally got back there, it was almost sunrise, and Rudolph's wife at this point was wide awake, standing by the front door. And the totally overwhelmed look on her face made Rudolph's stomach drop. He didn't need to ask her what was wrong. He could tell by the bags under her eyes that she must have been up all night answering phone calls intended for him, meaning more people must have died. So, as soon as Rudolph and the driver had moved the second body into the funeral home, they got back in the car to go pick up another, and then another, and another. By 10 a.m., there were 9 bodies waiting in the morgue, and the phone kept on ringing. Four hours later, at 2 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon, a man named August Chambon pulled into the driveway of his stately home in Denora. August was the town mayor, but he'd recently been away on business. So, when he walked inside, he immediately went to the pile of messages his family had written down for him while he was gone. And as he worked his way down the stack of paper, his face went pale. Like many people in Denora, August had had no idea that a mystery illness was suffocating people to death all over town, until he saw all these panicked messages from residents, doctors, and morticians begging him for help. August realized he had a very serious emergency on his hands. Denora didn't have a single hospital, and several of the town's doctors were too sick themselves to work, so people who fell ill literally didn't have anywhere to turn. Meanwhile, bodies were piling up, Between Rudolph's funeral home and the others in town, the death toll was now at 11 people. And based on the calls he'd received, August estimated that hundreds, maybe even thousands more people were sick. August spent the rest of the day doing whatever he could to help. He worked with local nurses to create emergency medical stations. He called in doctors from out of town to come help. He had extra oxygen and inhalers shipped into Donora. He even called the state health department for backup. But at the same time, August didn't make any emergency announcements. But in fairness, he didn't really have a way to. Donora didn't have a local TV or radio news station, and the newspaper was only published on weekdays. And since this disaster had happened on a weekend, the only way for news to travel was by word of mouth. So, while half the town did their best to deal with this mysterious outbreak, the other half was blissfully unaware, carrying on business as usual. The local high school even went ahead with their scheduled football game, even though their players literally couldn't see more than a few feet across the field. But finally, after what felt like one of the longest days of his life, August felt like he needed to call a town meeting. Everybody needed to know what was going on. However, he couldn't get everybody from the city council and the Board of Health together until the following morning. And so first thing the next morning, which was Sunday, October 31st, August made his way through the thick gray fog to a government building downtown. There, he met with a bunch of community leaders to discuss what was going on. And they all agreed that the fog must have something to do with it. But there were a lot of questions that nobody could answer, like what made this fog different? And why was it making some people sick and even killing some people, while others seemed totally unaffected by it? They couldn't make sense of it, let alone figure out how to stop it. Then, at some point during their conversation, August began to hear rain pattering down on the roof. He looked out the window and saw the drizzle turn into a full-on downpour, and he watched in amazement as the rain seemed to wash the fog away. The thick gray clouds that had hung over Donora for nearly a week disappeared in minutes. And with it, the mysterious illness disappeared too. Just like that, the phones at Donora's doctor's offices stopped ringing. It would take years for public health researchers to understand what had happened during that October week in Donora, Pennsylvania. And that's because there was essentially a large-scale misinformation campaign to hide the truth. However, eventually, the truth came out. The so-called fog that blanketed Donora that week was not actually normal Donora fog. It was smog from Donora's many industrial mills. These mills manufactured steel, zinc, and sulfuric acid, and as part of that process, they pumped dangerous chemical byproducts directly into the air. Normally, the smog would float up towards the sky and dissipate quickly. But during October 1948, Donora was hit by a very rare weather event called a temperature inversion, which in short kept these dangerous chemicals down at street level for days. It worked like this. Usually, air is warmest near the surface of the Earth and gets colder as it goes upward towards the sky. But during a temperature inversion, this gets flipped around. Warm air moves into the space above cold air and traps the heavier cold air underneath it. And when this happened in Donora, which was situated inside a natural bowl in the Earth, the warm air was almost like putting a lid on top of that bowl. And so the deadly chemical byproducts from the mills were trapped, turning the air in Donora into a concentrated poison. But because fog was so normal in the valley, most people didn't think anything of it. Plus, throughout that very consequential week, and for years afterwards, the owners of the mills insisted they were not to blame, putting out a blizzard of misleading information to defend themselves. They claimed the weather was the problem, not the chemical byproducts. And many locals believed this, because they didn't want the mills to shut down. 2/3 of the men in Donora worked there, and the majority of families in town depended on that income. All told, at least 70 people died as a result of what became known as the Donora smog, and over 4,000 people were sickened. Experts said that X-rays of survivors' lungs looked like victims of chemical warfare. The Donora smog incident was the worst air pollution disaster in United States history. But it also sparked a national conversation about air pollution and the need for better industrial safety regulations. 2 years later, in 1950, the US held its first ever National Air Pollution Conference. After that, progress was slow but steady. The nation's first major air pollution law was passed in 1963, and the Environmental Protection Agency was formed in 1970. As of today, all of Denora's industrial mills have been shut down. There's now a museum in that town that commemorates those who lost their lives during Denora smog, and proudly displays the slogan, "Clean air started here." One Saturday afternoon in November of 1990, a 26-year-old kindergarten teacher named Sue Lixia sat crying on a bench at a train station in the city of Naha, which is located in northeastern China. Sue had just left her husband for good. They'd had a bad marriage for a long time. It was very contentious. They fought all the time. And that morning, they had gotten into this major fight. And for Sue, it was kind of like the final straw. And so she just stormed into the bedroom, grabbed some things, threw it in a bag, and just stormed out. She was done. But Sue really didn't have a plan for what she was going to do once she left the house. And so she found herself just sitting at this train station doing nothing, just staring at the trains rolling in and out over and over again. And as she sat there, again, not knowing what she's going to do, she suddenly took stock of the fact that very few people were getting on and off of these trains. And in fact, the train station itself was weirdly vacant. So the city of Naha, where Sue was actually fairly small by China's standards, even though there was 70,000 people that lived there. The city sat at the base of this towering mountain, and then all around the city in the outskirts was basically just farmland with lots of soy and corn crops. And then as you move closer to the city center, there were lots of things you would expect to see in a city, like tall buildings and, residential and commercial areas. But overall, Naha was just kind of boring. It's like the city was a city, even if it was small, but there was just not much going on. And in fact, if you lived in China, but not in Naha, there was a very good chance you didn't know Naha even existed, like it was kind of irrelevant. However, in the last few months leading up to this moment that Sue is sitting at this train station, the city of Naha had suddenly been put on the map, and everybody knew about this city, because women from Naha were going missing in droves. In fact, Sue herself knew of at least a dozen women who had gone missing over the past few months from Naha. And as these women started going missing, it was making the news all over the country, and women who lived in Naha were acutely aware of the risks of being out alone, in fear that somebody was going to come snatch them up and take them away. In fact, every time Sue would go to work, she would make sure she would walk with other women, like in pairs, to ensure safety. This was a really scary time if you were a woman living in Naha. However, the caveat to the missing women was all of them to this point, when Sue was sitting at the train station, had been sex workers. And Sue, she thought, in virtue of not being a sex worker and instead being a kindergarten teacher, that somehow she was not actually that vulnerable to being snatched up or, whatever was happening to these women, she just felt like it wouldn't happen to her. But now, as Sue sat at this train station, which again was eerily quiet and vacant, she couldn't help but feel like she had made a bad decision being here. She felt like she could easily become the next woman who went missing from Naha. And so Sue began to think, maybe I should just go back home and try to patch things up with my husband, mostly for her safety, just to go back inside her home and be safe again. But before she could stand up to do that, she noticed on the other end of the platform this man who was exceptionally well dressed with this beautiful brown wool coat and fancy pants. He looked like he stepped straight out of a fashion magazine. He came up onto the train platform, and without saying a word, he walked slowly down the platform all the way to where Sue was, and he reached into his pocket and he held out a tissue to her because he saw she was crying. And Sue, she's looking up at the sky, and again, there's nobody else here, and she's very much on edge. And she doesn't know what to do. It was already creepy that this place was vacant, but it's even stranger to have a random man come up to her and try to initiate some sort of interaction with her. It just felt wrong and weird and very suspicious. But as Sue stared at this guy, trying to figure out what his angle was, she could see that he had kind of kept himself standing back from her, kind of a respectful distance, not trying to crowd her out. And he was looking at her with a very sympathetic look on his face, and he's holding this tissue out, and he said to her, "Are you okay?" And he hands the tissue again, like, "Please take it." And there was just something about this guy that felt very sincere, and Sue kind of let her guard down, and she accepted the tissue and wiped the tears from her eyes. She didn't say anything, and then this guy, he said, "Hey, do you mind if I sit with you?" And at this point, Sue said, "Yeah, okay, you can sit down." And so this very handsome, well-dressed man took a seat next to Sue, not right next to her, again, respectful distance from her. And again, he asked her, hey, are you doing okay? And for Sue, whose life had been basically miserable the last few months or even years with this terrible marriage she was in, she wasn't used to being asked if she was okay. And this man, who she didn't know, had caught her at this very vulnerable moment in her life. And it was like all her emotions just came pouring out. And she began sobbing hysterically, telling this guy that no, she was not okay. Her life was in ruins. She had just abandoned her family and she had no idea what she was going to do. And finally, when Sue stopped telling this guy all about her problems, she felt very embarrassed and kind of looked up at him like she was sorry for even saying as much. But the man, who was very intently listening, he was just nodding along, very sympathetic, and he told Sue that his name was Gia Wang, and that he was a director at a factory not far from here, and if she was open to it, he'd be happy to think about hiring her at the factory, give her a new start potentially, because it seemed like that's what she really needed. And then he asked her if she wanted to come back to his house to discuss this job opportunity further. Now with this, even though Sue had really appreciated everything this guy had done to this point, the second he asked her to come back to his house, she's like, red flags are going up. She knew there's something off here. Clearly this guy does have an angle and it's not to benefit me. And so she looked at him with an absolutely suspicious look, like, no way am I going to your house. I don't know you. Like, I appreciate the tissue and you letting me cry, but there's no way. But again, as she's staring at him with the suspicious look, the look on Gia's face remained very sympathetic and very gentle, and it almost seemed like he was just going to get up and go, like, hey, I'm sorry for offending you. But before he did get up to leave, Sue said, hold on. Actually, yes, I'll come with you. She didn't know why she agreed to go with him. Maybe it was because her life was so messed up at this point that she was just kind of ready to take chances and be sort of reckless, and this was definitely that. Big chance, very reckless. But again, she just felt like, there's something sincere about this guy, and she felt like she could trust him. And so Sue and Gia stood up, and together they walked down the train platform, not saying much. They went downstairs, they went out to the street, and they walked a couple of blocks to where Gia's street was. And as soon as they turned the corner and he showed Sue which house was his, Sue looked up, and whatever hesitations she had had still to that point about following this stranger to his house were gone, because she saw his house was beautiful. It wasn't that it was so grand or anything. It totally fit with the neighborhood, but it was very well maintained and totally felt on brand for a guy who was so well dressed and so well manicured and frankly so handsome. So Gia led the way to the front door of his house. He unlocked the door, he opened it up, and then he gently gestured for Sue to come on inside. And so she did. She walked past him. Gia followed her in, and the two of them took off their shoes and made their way into the kitchen, where Gia brewed some tea for them, and then they both sat down and began to sip their tea and talk about this job opportunity. And so for a few minutes, Gia is telling Sue all about the role and what she might be doing. And Sue is kind of asking general questions about it. But, for the most part, she just kind of enjoyed being in the presence of somebody who seemed to care about her. But after she finished her entire glass of tea, suddenly Gia, who had been talking this whole time about the factory, just stopped. It was like he was waiting for her to drink that entire drink. And as soon as she was done with her cup, Gia, again, he went quiet and just stared at Sue with this kind of sinister look on his face, like he was very pleased with what was going on. And at that point, Sue looked down at her teacup and then back at Gia. Then suddenly she began to feel very drowsy. It was like her vision was beginning to go. And she realized Gia clearly had poisoned her. There was something inside of her tea. And so before she could do anything, everything went black. A couple of weeks later, just a few blocks away from where Sue met Gia at the train station, a police officer named Zhang was standing behind his desk at the police station when a very concerned-looking elderly couple came inside. Now, this couple was here to speak with Zhang about a missing person, but the missing person was not Sue. She had been missing for 2 weeks now. Nobody had seen her, but no one had reported her missing. Her husband had just assumed that Sue had left him, and that's why he hadn't seen her, and so he had naturally not reported that. And again, nobody else knew she was missing, so keep that in mind. Officer Zhang has no idea about Sue and Gia, none of it. But when this elderly couple came in to make a missing person report, Officer Zhang was not the least bit surprised. It was now December of 1990, and over the past 6 months, 20 women out of Naha had suddenly gone missing. Remember, Sue is not one of those 20. The 20 are mostly sex workers who went missing at that same train station where Sue met Gia. And so Officer Zhang was used to making all these missing person reports. But candidly, the police actually felt like, because these were sex workers that were going missing, they weren't sure if they were actually being abducted or if they were simply getting on a train and kind of leaving town to go work somewhere else. And so really there wasn't a whole lot of investigation happening to figure out why so many of these women were going missing. But again, Officer Zhang, he's not surprised that they're telling him they want to file a missing person report. But when Zhang took this elderly couple to an interview room to talk to them about whoever was missing in their lives, when this couple spoke, Officer Zhang knew this was different, because the couple was not reporting another missing woman from Naha who also happened to be a sex worker. Instead, they were reporting that a man was missing, a businessman. However, the details of his disappearance sounded eerily similar to all these sex-working women who had also gone missing. This guy was last seen at that same train station where Sue had met Jia, and then nobody had seen him, and so that's why they were here. And so Officer Zhang, he wrote up their report, and then he told the couple that, very likely this man is okay, and he'll show up at some point under his own steam, but he told them the police would look into it, and they'd be in touch. However, as this couple got up and turned around and left, Officer Zhang couldn't help but feel like this missing man and all these missing women went missing from the same place, and it's the same city, and it's the same pattern over and over again, but now we have a man. And even though Zhang wanted to write it off as an anomaly, he started to wonder if this missing man was connected to all these missing women. Because by January of 1991, so 2 months after Sue had gone missing without a trace and still had not been reported by anybody, and 6 weeks after that elderly couple reported that man missing, another 5 people from Naha had gone missing, 2 more women and 3 more men. And so now the police in Naha were looking at 26 people, men and women, that had all gone missing very recently out of Naha, and nobody had a clue what happened to them. And importantly, because now there were men who were not sex workers who were going missing, the police couldn't just write this whole thing off as, oh, these sex working women are just going to another city to go do their work there. Like that was not a possibility anymore. Clearly something bad was happening, and the police knew they really needed to do a real investigation here. So finally, in early spring of that year, the police in Naha formed a task unit and legitimately began investigating all these disappearances. But amazingly, there was no information. There was nothing. These people went missing and nobody heard from them. There was no evidence of where they went. There was not even any sign that anything bad happened to them because no bodies had been found. There was no evidence of really anything happening. All the police knew is these 26 people, not including Sue, so she would be the 27th person, had been at this train station and then vanished. And that's all they knew. And it got to the point where this story really began to spread around China, and it became like this running joke that if you don't want to live, go to Naha, because everybody assumed there had to be some sort of serial killer or something happening there who was just roaming the streets, picking people off. By late summer of 1991, when really this story had taken hold across the country and was becoming a bigger and bigger deal because there was absolutely no resolution here, police had no idea what was going on, well, the whole situation got a whole lot worse because now, in addition to people suddenly vanishing at the train station in Naha, more people were also going missing in other cities nearby Naha, but all along the same train line that left out of Naha. So more train stations, more disappearances, all around the area, not just the city of Naha, but all around. And by the fall of that year, when over 30 people had gone missing all the same way from these train stations all around Naha, the police still had absolutely nothing to go on. All they had is, here are these people, here's where they were, they vanished, we got nothing else, no bodies, no evidence, nothing. But all that would change on October 22nd, 1991, roughly a year after Sue met Jia at the train station in Naha and then drank that drugged tea. On that October day in 1991, so again a year after the disappearance of Sue, police at this train station, 1,700 miles away from the city of Naha, were doing random stops of commuters on the train platform. This had nothing to do with the ongoing investigation into all these missing people. This was just like public safety stuff, where the police were kind of just walking around, looking for people who looked suspicious, and then checking in on them to make sure they weren't doing anything illegal. And on this particular day, at this train station far away from Naha, one of these officers spotted this very handsome guy in a beautiful brown wool coat and very fancy pants and shoes, and he stood out a lot because of, frankly, how beautiful he was. And so the police officer saw him, and this very handsome guy looked up, and he saw the police officer, and it was like immediately he did something very suspicious. He reached down, grabbed a bag, and quickly turned around and began walking away. And at the same time, two other people who were right near this very handsome guy did the same thing. They grabbed bags off the ground, quickly turned around, fell in line with this handsome guy, and began quickly walking away from the police. And so the police obviously are totally suspicious. They run across the platform, and they manage to stop all three of them, and they turn them around, and they say, "Show me your bags, open them up." And the police, they would open up these bags, and they contain drugs. And so right away, these three know they are caught, but they don't say anything. They just stand there and they're totally silent as the police are asking them, like, what are these drugs? Where are you going with these? What's going on here? They're not talking. And so finally, the police go, "Give me your IDs right now." And so all three of them cough up their IDs, and the very handsome guy with the beautiful brown wool coat and fancy clothes, well, that was Jia Wang. The same Jia Wang who had gone with Sue into his house and given her the drugged tea. But again, these police officers are only concerned about the drugs. They don't know anything about these guys. They don't know that Jia met Sue and did this thing at his house with the tea. That wasn't even reported to police. Nobody knew about it. But these police knew they had caught these three people with these bags of illegal drugs, so they brought them back to the station and began to question each of them. And when they spoke to Jia, Jia said nothing. However, when they spoke to the two other people that were with Jia, one of them began to crack. It was obvious they had more to tell about these drugs, and, they were kind of holding back tears, like they were very upset. And one of the interrogators, sensing one of these people was prepared to confess to something, instead of really drilling down on them, he was very comforting. And he offered them a blanket and said, "Here, take this blanket, relax, it's okay. You can tell me what's on your mind, it's okay." And that just totally broke this person. And they said, "These drugs are nothing. You need to see what's in Jia's house. That will put these drugs to the side. They won't matter. What's in his house is horrible." The next day, a phone rang in the police station in Naha, and Officer Zhang picked it up, and it was one of the officers who interviewed these three people with drugs and got this whole horrible confession about what was inside of this guy Jia's house, and he told Zhang all about it. And as Zhang is listening to this, his eyes went wide because he knew this had to be connected to all these people going missing. Like, this has to be it. And so as soon as he hung up the phone, Officer Zhang rounded up 20 other police officers and 10 forensic doctors to go search Jia's house. And when they got there, the house from the outside looked just as beautiful as when Sue had seen it for the first time and felt like her reservations about Jia had gone down because of how wonderful his house looked. But as soon as all those police officers and the forensic doctors stepped inside of Jia's house, he wasn't home, there was nobody there. When they went inside, they were instantly hit with this horrible, horrible smell inside the house. Even though things are neat and beautiful inside too, there was something bad inside this house. And the smell seemed to be coming from the basement. And so at some point, Officer Zhang and the other officers, they got to the door, they opened it up, and they looked down, and all they could see was just this dark room down there, and the smell was so strong. But they pulled their shirts up over their faces, and they went down the stairs, and when they got down there, they couldn't see anything, it's totally dark. But the smell at this point was so overpowering that a couple of the officers almost fainted. And so literally they had to leave the house fearing they were breathing in toxic chemicals or something, and they had to wear gas masks just to go back into the house and back down into the basement. And when they got back down there, now wearing their masks, it didn't seem like there was anything down there that could produce such an awful smell. Like there was just nothing down there. But eventually one of the officers moved to the middle of the basement, right in the middle, and they realized there was an opening. And they looked down into it and they couldn't believe what they saw. And at the same time, somebody upstairs made an equally horrifying discovery because they discovered a videotape, a VHS cassette that contained this horrible footage that effectively explained what was going on inside of that pit in the basement. But to understand that, we need to go back a year to when Sue met Jia at the train station. She went back to his house and drank the drugged tea and blacked out. After Sue drank that tea, she didn't die. Jia did not kill her. Instead, she woke up a few hours later being totally confused, and she was immediately hit by this horrible smell, but it was totally pitch black. She can't see anything, and she began feeling her hands around her, and she felt stone everywhere she touched, and eventually she realized she was in what felt like the bottom of a well. But it wasn't water she was standing in. She was standing in something that almost felt like jelly, and she began kind of touching it to figure out what it was. She could not tell, but she couldn't help but feel like the things around her were kind of moving, like they were alive. And Then suddenly a lid that clearly sat atop of this pit began to slide over above her. And so suddenly light was coming down into this pit. And at first, Sue looked up and she didn't see anything, but then she looked down and realized what was all around her. It was people, dead people, and potentially even half-alive people that were just stuffed into this big pit that were all kind of decaying or, slowly dying or whatever it was. And she's just standing amongst it all. And then she looks up and she sees it's Gia, the beautiful man who had brought her here. He's standing up there looking down at her with a smile on his face. And Sue immediately pleads with him to please spare me, don't kill me. And Gia, he looks down at her kind of inquisitively, and he says, if I lift you out of there, will you do anything I tell you to do? And Sue said, yes, I'll do anything. Just get me out of here, please. And so Gia, he reached down, he grabbed Sue, and he pulled her up and out of this pit inside of this basement. A few days later, Sue was back at the train station where she had met Gia for the first time, but this time she was alone. And she walked up onto that train platform with no intention of riding a train. Instead, as soon as she got up there, she began looking around, and then she spotted a businessman who was sitting on a bench. And she walked over to him, and she sat down next to him, and we don't know exactly what she said, but we think what she said was something maybe sexually suggestive or, something along those lines, and she's holding his shoulders and touching his hand. She doesn't know this man, and this man is very caught off guard by this, but he's kind of going along with it. And before long, she takes this businessman's hand, they stand up, and they walk out of the train station down to the street, and they make their way a couple blocks over to Gia's house. And when they get there, Sue leads into the front door, she opens it up, she brings the man inside, the door shuts, they take their shoes off, and Sue leads this man into the kitchen, where Gia is waiting with a wire between each hand. And as soon as this businessman walked into the kitchen, Gia pounced on him, wrapped the wire around his neck and held it until the man passed out. And then he released the wire. And then Gia and Sue took this man, they lifted him up, and they carried him down into the basement and laid him out on the floor. So he's not in the pit, he's just out in the middle of the basement floor. Then Gia stepped away, picked up a video camera, turned it on, and began to film. He was filming the man on the ground and also Sue. And Sue, she knew what to do. She was going to do anything she was told to do. So she climbed on top of this still very much alive businessman who's just been knocked unconscious, and she straddles him so she's looking down at his head. Then she picks up a knife and she holds it in front of her. And then she looks up at Gia, who at this point has zoomed the camera in. She can hear the sound, the mechanics inside of the camera as it's zooming in on what she's about to do. And then she raises the knife over her head and drives it into this man's chest. The video that Gia shot of Sue murdering this man was the video police found on the first floor of the house shortly after police had found this horrible pit in Gia's basement. It would turn out that Gia Wang was absolutely the serial killer who was responsible for all these people going missing from the train stations. He would abduct them just like he did Sue, and he would bring them to his house, and then he would do horrible, horrible things to them, and eventually he would chuck their bodies into this pit. And so when he abducted Sue, he actually thought that when he drugged her, that he had killed her, and he had chucked her into the pit, believing she was dead. But when Sue had woken up inside of that pit, when he opened it up and looked down and there she was, fully alive, he had an idea. Well, why don't I turn Sue into a murderer like me? She can help me. And so that was the condition for her being pulled out of this pit, that she would assist him in murdering people, and she agreed to do it. And so the reason the profile of victims changed from sex-working women to random men is because those are the people that Sue went after. She began targeting men. And so when that elderly couple came in and reported to Officer Zhang that a man was missing, that was Sue's first victim, the man who had been seen on video being stabbed in the chest by Sue. Now, nobody to this day understands why Sue actually went along with this. Like, she was pulled up out of the pit, but then when she was told to go to the train station and find your first victim, it's unclear why she didn't just go to the police and say, hey, there's a serial killer, Gia, here's his house, here's where he is, go get him. For some reason, she just did what he said. And in fact, Sue was not the only person who was brought into this murdering scheme. He managed to convince 3 other people, including his ex-wife, to also commit murders for him. And all 3 of those people also had ample opportunity to flee and tell police, but they didn't. All of these people just did what Gia wanted without asking any questions. It was like he had absolute control over these people. That is, until that day in October of 1991, when those police officers doing a public safety check spotted Gia along with 2 accomplices fleeing with drugs. And they stopped them and they got them back to the station. And one of his accomplices finally broke and told the truth. And the person who told the truth, the accomplice who broke, was Sue. She was there with him at the train station. Nobody knew she was missing. And she was the one who, when offered a blanket and was told, tell us the truth, she came clean. Ultimately, it was this police officer's kindness that broke her. In Gia's basement, inside of that horrible pit, right in the middle of it, were 42 bodies, 24 women and 18 men. In the end, Gia and all 4 of his forced accomplices, including Sue, were sentenced to death, and they were executed on January 24th, 1992. Today, the city of Naha is still just as infamous as it was in the 90s when these murders took place. And in fact, the nickname for Naha is now just Bandit City to reflect what happened there. 2014, the United States Navy decided it was time to decommission one of their old frigate ships, and so they sent it to a dock to be broken down for scrap. In order for workers to actually be able to access the underside of the ship and actually begin to break it down, they would need to dry dock the ship, which meant the ship would basically drive into this special locking corral where the doors would shut behind it, the water would drain out from underneath, and the ship would be left resting on these huge wooden blocks that elevated it off the ground. And with no water in there, workers were able to get underneath the hull and could access every part of the ship without obstruction. It's important to note for this story that when a ship is in dry dock, there is only one way on or off. It's this ramp called a gangway that leads from the dock onto the deck of the ship. Besides that, there is nowhere else for you to get on this ship. And if for some reason you really wanted to get on and couldn't use the gangway, you could in theory try to run and leap from the dock to the ship. There's a pretty significant gap there all the way around, but you could try the jump. But if you weren't successful at grabbing onto the ship, you would fall multiple stories, probably to your death, because there's no water in the dry dock. So this old frigate ship that was being decommissioned was officially dry docked in July of 2014. The first group of people that went on board the ship to begin dismantling it were military personnel. They were in charge of removing all of the sensitive equipment before civilians were allowed to go on board. The military personnel begin to wrap up, and it's getting late in the day, and they tell the foreman, who's in charge of all of the civilian workers that are going to be going on and finishing this decommissioning of this ship. They go to the foreman and they say, hey, we're done, we're wrapped up for the night, your workers are good to go, they can get on here tomorrow. The foreman would send a message to his boss that night, letting him know that they were on track to start work the next day. The boss would respond and say, hey, can you go on there tonight and take pictures of all the different workstations so we know how many people that we need to place in different segments of this big ship. So the foreman walks onto the ship and proceeds to take hundreds of pictures all over the inside of the ship. Now, the ship itself was pitch black inside. There was no electricity and it was nighttime. So he had a flashlight the whole time, but whenever he took a picture, he would turn his flashlight off and then use the flash on his camera before going back to his actual flashlight. So all night he's going room to room taking all these pictures, and at some point he realizes he's photographed everything he needs to. So he leaves, he goes back to his office, he uploads the pictures and he sends them to his boss. His boss wrote back almost immediately and just said, "Who's the guy with the axe?" Now, the foreman has no idea what he's talking about. He was just in the ship by himself for a couple of hours and didn't see anyone. So he reads the email again to make sure he read it correctly, and he sees that his boss has actually attached the picture he is referring to. Here is this guy clearly clutching an axe in a hallway that he was just in. And even creepier is the foreman is looking at where this picture was taken, and it was relatively early on in his photo shoot. And he had walked past the exact area where this guy is poking his head out of, which means the whole time he was down there, this guy with an axe was there with him. They review the security footage of a camera that was aimed directly at the ramp, the one entrance in and out of this ship. And from the time the foreman left, no one else left. So they don't know how he got on or how he got off without being detected, but somehow he did.
In 2014, Alan Ruby was a 19-year-old freshman studying political science at the University of Oklahoma. Despite being relatively modest and soft-spoken in person, on social media, he projected this lifestyle of wealth and grandeur. He'd oftentimes post pictures of exotic sports cars and expensive watches and clothes, and he would travel the world to Paris, London, New York City, and take all these pictures showing off this incredible life he had. He really wanted people to believe that he was this fabulously wealthy, successful guy. Alan was only able to project this phony lifestyle on social media because he was spending his father's money. His father was a successful businessman who was also the publisher of a newspaper that was quite successful, and so Alan would just spend his money, and then even after his father would give him money, Alan would steal his credit card and additionally rack up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. But as media began to shift away from print media to almost all digital, a lot of newspapers began to fail because they weren't able to transition to digital. And his father's newspaper was not making that transition very well, and they were losing money left and right. And so Alan's father told everybody in his family, with a focus on Alan, that we all need to cut back on our spending because money's tight right now and it's unclear if it's going to turn around. So we got to be careful with how much money we do have. Alan acted like he was going to cut back on his lavish lifestyle, but in reality, he wasn't going to. He was totally addicted to spending money and giving off this vibe that he was so wealthy and successful. And so around this time, Alan steals his grandmother's credit card and secretly leaves the country and goes to Paris to have this vacation on his own. He's taking these pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and he's spending all this money. And his father finds out that he's stolen this credit card and he's furious. And instead of waiting for Alan to come home and saying, don't do that again, he decides he's going to send him a message that he's going to remember. And he calls the police. Alan gets charged with theft. He pleads guilty and he has to go before a judge who sees that he has no criminal record. So he kind of goes easy on him. And he says that you need to pay back all the money you spent to your grandmother. And you need to go to an addiction program to try to break this habit of yours, to stop spending all this money. After Alan leaves court, his father felt like he finally got the message. It seemed like it had finally gotten through to him that this was a really big problem, and he felt like he had made the right decision in calling the police. But in reality, Alan hadn't changed at all. As soon as he got back from court, he was stealing from people outside of the family, he was taking loans from loan sharks, all of this just to keep up with his phony appearance he portrayed on social media. On October 9th, 2014, Alan owed $3,000 to a particular loan shark and had no way of paying it back. So instead of asking his parents for money, which for him would have been too embarrassing, he decides the best course of action is to kill his entire family. And so he strolls into his home and he shoots his mom dead, he shoots his sister dead, and then he waits for his dad to come home and he shoots him dead. Because his big plan is, with his whole family gone, he's going to become the sole heir to the family's estate, and that will be enough money to not only pay off this $3,000 debt, but have a little left over so he can go on vacation to Paris again. So after he's committed this horrible crime, he leaves his family where they are. He goes and takes the surveillance footage from inside the house. It was on a DVD, takes the DVD out, takes the murder weapon, leaves the house, chucks the DVD and the weapon into a lake, and proceeds to drive to Dallas, where he checks into a very fancy hotel and meets up with friends and parties the whole weekend. His friends that were with him that weekend would later tell investigators that Alan seemed totally normal. There was no red flags. There was no indication that anything was wrong. He was just laughing it up and having a great time that whole weekend. The following Monday, when Alan's father doesn't show up for work, the police are notified. They go to the house and they find the Ruby family. When police went out and got Alan and brought him back to the station to chat with him and tell him what happened and see if he knew anything, his sad reaction to his whole family now being deceased was apparently so insincere that officers almost immediately assumed that he was probably the guy that did it. Ultimately, Alan would confess, and the prosecutor wanted to push for the death penalty, but Alan's remaining living family members actually said, don't do the death penalty. We don't want to risk that not happening. We want to see justice served right now. Can we create a plea agreement where he gets life in jail, but there's absolutely no way for him to get paroled, no matter how good his behavior is, no matter how old he is, no matter what, he can't ever get out of jail. And so they did. They created that plea agreement. They gave it to Alan to sign. He signs it, and as they're walking out of the courtroom, his last remaining family members disown him and say, "May God have mercy on your soul," and they leave. This is the picture that Allen uploaded to his Instagram account just hours after killing his entire family. They're all lying on the ground in his house at the time this picture is being taken. He's in this fancy hotel room with his friends, and the caption reads, "College wouldn't be half as fun without these two peaches. Hashtag best friends." One night in the early 1950s, a little boy named Issei Sagawa was having this dream where he and his brother were being boiled alive to be eaten. Sagawa says when he woke up, he immediately began fantasizing about what it would be like to be on the other side of that, to be on the outside with a human inside of the pot that you're boiling, that you're going to eat. And he became totally obsessed with the idea of eating another person. By the time he was in first grade, he would find himself staring at his different classmates' legs, and his mouth would be watering because he wanted to take a bite out of their leg. For 3 decades, he was able to suppress that urge, but in 1981, those cannibalistic urges would get the better of him. One summer day while he was in Tokyo, he saw this woman that he wanted to eat, and he couldn't help himself, and so he began following her down the road, and he saw her go into her apartment. He waited for a minute, went around back, and climbed in the window. And when he got inside, she was asleep. And he hadn't thought of a plan for what he was going to do once he was inside. And so he's just standing there thinking, well, now what do I do? How am I going to eat her? What am I going to do next? And as he's sitting there wondering what to do next, she wakes up and she screams and he runs away. After this breaking and entering incident, Sagawa would actually seek help. So he goes to a psychiatrist and he says, this is what I did. I snuck into her house because I wanted to eat her. And the psychiatrist would end up telling Sagawa's family that I have to label him a high risk to society because he's not just thinking about doing these things, he's already acting out these fantasies. Now, Sagawa's father was extremely wealthy and powerful, and when he heard this from the psychiatrist, he was like, no, we're not going to do that. And so using his power and influence, he was able to kind of cover up what the psychiatrist had found, and he shipped his son to Paris. Once Sagawa landed in Paris, he enrolled at the Sorbonne University and began studying literature. Despite having sought help for his cannibalistic urges, when he was in Paris, he started having that urge again and he couldn't control it, and instead of going to another therapist or psychiatrist, he begins to look for another victim. Sagawa considered himself short, weak, and ugly, and so he was actually looking for a tall, beautiful Western woman so he could absorb their energy and somehow become a bigger, better version of himself. And so he began looking around Paris for tall, beautiful women that he could potentially eat, but no one seemed like a good fit until he met Renee Hartvelt. Renee was a tall, beautiful 25-year-old Dutch student who was going to school with Sagawa at Sorbonne. In order to get close to her, Sagawa would ask his father if he would give him some money so he could hire Renee to be his personal tutor. His father gives him the money, Sagawa hires Renee, and they strike up this working relationship together. And over time, Sagawa would build trust with Renee, they would become friends, and at some point he asked Renee if she'll actually come over to his apartment, something they had not done yet. And she's sitting in his apartment with her back turned to him. He leaves the room and comes back with a rifle, and he tries to fire it, but it jams. And she hasn't heard him do this, and so he's standing there and his weapon's now jammed. He hasn't fired it, and he just puts the weapon away and comes back out and acts like nothing's happened. And he's sitting there wondering, is this a sign that I'm not supposed to do this? But at the end of the night, when she finally left, he decides, you know what, I gotta go through with this. I have to eat her. And so the next night he gets her to come over again. He gets the rifle out when she's sitting with her back to him once again, except this time the rifle fires. Only for an instant, he felt really bad and thought, maybe I should call an ambulance. But then he stopped himself and he said, you've waited so long for this. You gotta just go through with it. He immediately tried to take a bite out of her, but it was too difficult and unpalatable. So he calmly leaves his apartment, he goes to the store, he gets a blade, he comes back, and he's able to begin removing pieces of Renee so he can eat them. Over the next 2 days, Sagawa would eat most of Renee, and he would take pictures of himself throughout the entire experience. When he finally felt full, he left a couple pieces still in his freezer, but put the rest of her in a suitcase and went to dump her in a lake. But as he was wheeling these heavy suitcases around town, people saw them, and it just drew a lot of suspicion. And at some point, someone must have called the police. They show up, they ask him what's inside the suitcase, they open it up, and there's Renee. When questioned about it, he just said, I killed her to eat her flesh. Sagawa awaited trial for 2 years in a French prison, and when he finally went in front of a French judge, when the judge read the details of this crime, it seemed so crazy and outrageous that the judge decided there's no way Sagawa can be sane. And so he was deemed insane and unfit to stand trial. He was ordered to go to a mental institution where he would be held indefinitely. Shortly after that, the French deported Sagawa back to Japan, where they expected him to remain in a mental institution for the rest of his life. But that didn't happen because the French dropped his case and his documents were sealed. And when he arrived in Japan, the Japanese could not get access to his court documents, and so they did not have a case against Sagawa, and so they had to let him walk free. And so in 1986, Sagawa checked himself out of the Japanese mental institution that he had been sent to, and he's been free ever since. This is a picture of what police discovered when they opened up Sagawa's fridge inside of his apartment in Paris. This is a picture of his kitchen inside of that apartment, where you can clearly see plates and different utensils that were all used to eat Renee. This is a picture of the suitcase that Sagawa was lugging around that police showed up and asked him to open and found Renee inside of. And this is Sagawa today, walking freely in Tokyo, even though he blatantly killed and ate someone and openly admits to it and has even profited off of it. He's written books and he's been featured on TV shows. He's even been called in to be a food critic. But what's even more horrifying is that Sagawa openly says that before he dies, he's going to do this again. He can't live with himself unless he eats at least one more person. So that Dr. Guy Garman, also known as Doc Deep, was an avid scuba diver, and in 2015, he decided he was going to put his scuba diving to the test and try to break the world record for the deepest recreational scuba dive. At the time, the current record was 1,090 feet, set by a man named Ahmed Gaber in 2014. Guy's plan was to go down to 1,090 feet and then keep going to 1,200 feet, and that would be his record-setting mark. But in order to do that, you need a dive site that goes down to 1,200 feet. But luckily, Guy did most of his scuba diving off the coast of St. Croix in the Caribbean, and that area was known for an incredibly deep dive spot. Now, when most people think of scuba diving in the Caribbean, they think of beautiful clear water and amazing coral reef and exotic fishes, and everyone's so happy and it's so great and the water's so warm. And off St. Croix, that was true. But if you continued going offshore about 250 feet, you'd reach a drop-off that's known as the wall. And we're not talking about a gradual drop-off. We're talking about the seafloor going from flat to turning 45 degrees and going straight down 2 miles into a complete black abyss. Now, the only people that are actually allowed to dive into the wall are very experienced scuba divers with all the certifications. But if you're a tourist and you come to St. Croix, you can still scuba dive off the coast, where it is beautiful and shallow and warm and there's reefs and fish, but you're allowed to swim out to the edge of the wall. And people report getting out there and standing on the edge of this cliff, looking in the water with their mask and not being prepared for how intimidating it is. I mean, you're standing on one side where behind you is like this tropical paradise, and in front of you is this seemingly endless void where we don't even know what's down there. I mean, we've only explored 10% of the ocean. These deep portions of the ocean, we can't get down, so we don't know what's down there. What we do know is that sometimes whales will dive down into these deeper sections of the water, and scientists will be tracking their dive, and when they come up again, after only going down maybe 1,000 or 2,000 feet, they'll return with these massive bites taken out of them, because apparently there are creatures down there that we haven't discovered yet that are so big and so aggressive that a whale seems like a reasonable thing to go after for food. And so imagine standing on the edge of this cliff looking out and being like, what's down there? Well, our boy Guy decides, I'm going to find out what's down there, and I'm going to do my record-setting dive at the wall. And so after meticulous planning and hiring a support team that's going to be there to help him do this dive, he, his wife, and his son fly to St. Croix and they get ready to do this dive. Guy had arranged for a line to be lowered right at the edge of the wall that was weighted down by an anchor that was going to go down all the way to 1,300 feet. And they would put a metal placard at the 1,200 foot mark on the actual line so that when Guy went down, he would reach that placard at 1,200 feet. That's the record-setting mark. He would use a grease pen to mark the placard to indicate, I made it, this is legitimate, and then he would go back up, and that's how the dive was going to go. And so in the early morning of August 15th, 2015, Guy, along with his big support team, they head out to the edge of the wall. Guy gets into the water along with his son, who's going to go down with him for the first 200 feet, and he looks up at the support boat and he gives him the okay. He's ready to start the dive, and then he and his son give the signal. They're ready to go down,
and they start their descent into the void. As they're sinking lower and lower and lower in the water column, it's getting darker and darker until it's completely and totally pitch black. They reach the 200-foot mark, they come to a stop as was planned, and Guy's son Kip would give his father a squeeze for good luck because they can't communicate, and then Kip would go back up, and Guy on his own continues down to the 1,200-foot mark. Once Guy was on his own, a timer started because it's very important to track how long he's down at depth, and his team was expecting him to be back up at the 350-foot mark in 38 minutes from when his son left. But 38 minutes came and went, and he was not at the 350-foot mark. But even though this is a big problem, Guy had a whole bunch of extra air canisters with him, and so if he ran into any sort of problem, he would be able to continue to breathe air and fix the problem before coming up. It would just mean longer decompression stops along the way up. And since he was tethered to the guideline, they knew he couldn't drift away. And so they just had to wait and hope that he ran into some problem and that he would fix it eventually and then he would come back up again. But he never did. They couldn't really send a rescue mission down to get him because Guy was going so deep. He was the only one that was able to get down there. No one else was qualified or would be able to do it or had the right equipment for it. He was totally on his own down there. It would take 3 days before they were able to get the right equipment that was able to pull this lineup out of the water, and attached at the end of it was Guy, and he was deceased. He had drowned. But the really scary thing about what happened to Guy is when he went down into that abyss, he had all these extra air canisters attached to him. And so presumably he went down the line, probably all the way down to the record-breaking mark, and then he got trapped somehow. And as he's trapped on this line in total darkness, surrounded by who knows what down there, probably for several hours, he just cycled through his backup air canisters wondering, am I gonna run out of air and drown? Or am I gonna get attacked by some animal down here? There is this tiny little stream that winds its way through a forest in Yorkshire, England called the Bolton Strid. It's not very wide, you could jump over it. It doesn't appear to be very deep, it looks like maybe a foot or two, and it's not moving very fast, but that's all an illusion. There are signs up all over the place that say do not go near the Bolton Strid, it kills people. Because just beneath the surface of this seemingly tame water body is a natural booby trap that has a 100% mortality rate, meaning every single person that has ever stepped foot in the Bolton Strid has died. In 1998, Barry and Lynn Colletwer were walking along the Bolton Strid on their second day of their honeymoon, and all of a sudden a torrential downpour starts just raining down on them, and the rocks they were on suddenly got pretty slick, and Lynn slips and falls into the Strid. Barry, being a good husband, runs over to try to save her, and he too falls into the Strid. A man named Desmond Thomas was on the other side of the Strid, and he saw Barry as he was running for his wife, and he saw him fall in, and he watched Barry's face as he was looking at him as if he was going to stay afloat at the top. Desmond said it looked like someone came up and grabbed his leg and yanked him under the water, and he didn't see him again. Lynn's body was found 6 days later in West Yorkshire, and Barry's body was found over a month later, 10 miles downstream. In another case, in 2010, an 8-year-old boy named Aaron Page was playing by the Bolton Strid for his birthday. There's an area that's totally safe, that's away from the Strid, where people have picnics and that kind of thing. And he came down to the edge of the Strid and was running on the rocks, and he slipped and he fell in. Now, an adult saw this happen and they ran over and they were able to grab onto him while he's in the water. But the pull from inside the water was so strong that this person couldn't hold on to this child, who was eventually sucked under and dragged away and drowned. And beyond these two reports, there's dozens of others of people trying to jump over the Strid and falling in and drowning. So why is the Bolton Strid so deadly? If you look at this picture, this is of the River Wharfe, and it's just a little ways upstream of the Bolton Strid. And all this water in the River Wharfe gets funneled into the Bolton Strid. And the way it fits through that narrow section that is the Bolton Strid is the river turns on its side. So when you're looking at the Bolton Strid and you think, oh, that's not that deep. Well, it is that deep. It's at least as deep as the River Wharfe is wide. And if you look at it on the surface and you say, oh, well, the Bolton Strid's not moving very fast. Well, that's because underneath the surface, there is a whipping current. And in fact, the current that runs through the Strid is so strong that if you were standing on one of the rocks overlooking the water, you're looking down into the Bolton Strid. Well, you're not really standing on solid rock. You're kind of standing on a ledge. You just don't know it because the water meets the edge of the ledge. Underneath the rock you're standing on, the water has completely carved it out. So if you were to fall in, before you get sucked under the water, you would get sucked against the side and you would disappear under one of those shelves and go way far back underneath these rocks. And then you'd get sucked under and drown. And a lot of people who fall into the Strid, they don't make it out the other side. They don't get downstream. They get pulled into all these different caverns and tunnels that have been carved out by that current, and they're trapped in there forever because no one's going in to retrieve them, not even with scuba gear. Because if you get in there with scuba gear, the current will push you into these different caves and you aren't getting out again. On June 1st, 1937, Amelia Earhart took off from Oakland, California on an eastbound flight around the world. It was her second attempt to become the first pilot ever to circumnavigate the globe. She, along with her flight navigator Fred Noonan, flew to Miami and then down to South America, across the Atlantic to Africa, and then east to India and Southeast Asia. The pair reached Lae, New Guinea on June 29th. A couple days later, on July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan would depart Lae, and they would make their way to tiny Howland Island, which was their next refueling stop, but they would never arrive. What Earhart was trying to accomplish at the time was such a big deal, and so when they disappeared, it was heartbreaking, and it made international headlines, and this huge search is launched for them, but they can't find them, and after 2 weeks, they officially declared they were lost at sea and most likely dead. 3 years later, and 350 miles away from Howland Island, which was the island Earhart and Noonan were trying to get to before they vanished, a British scientist was on this tiny little uninhabited island called Niku Maroro, and they made a startling discovery. He found an incomplete skeleton next to what looked like the remains of a campfire, and their skeleton was kind of torn all over the place, like they had been ripped limb from limb. Because of Niku Maroro's proximity to Howland Island, everybody speculated that this has got to be the body of either Amelia Earhart or Noonan. The bones were sent to 2 doctors in Fiji, and they unfortunately said, no, this isn't Earhart or Noonan, this is somebody else. So those bones were ultimately disposed of because no one could claim them or knew who they were, and everybody just kind of forgot about it until 2017, when a forensic anthropologist decided to manually re-examine the measurements of the bones that were taken off of Niku Maroro Island and compare them to real measurements of Amelia Earhart. And they discovered that clearly those doctors in Fiji had made a mistake because the measurements of these bones match Amelia Earhart almost exactly. So researchers go back to Niku Maroro Island and they go to the area where these bones were found near that campfire, and they look around and they find a couple 1930s era bottles, glass bottles, and one of them is a freckle cream, and Amelia Earhart had lots of freckles and she liked to use freckle cream to cover them up. She was kind of famous for doing that. And so they found that freckle cream on this island near bones that look like they belong to Amelia Earhart. So while some scientists are putting their energy into confirming that yes, those bones were Amelia Earhart. We don't have the bones, but we can show you with the measurements and the freckle cream. And there's another picture that apparently shows the landing gear of her plane off of Niku Maroro Island. So there's some people that are working on that angle. And there's another group of scientists and researchers that are saying, okay, let's assume that that really was Amelia Earhart. Let's figure out what happened to her once she got to Niku Maroro Island. And the leading theory is horrifying. Although Niku Maroro Island is uninhabited by people, it is inhabited by one of the scariest creatures on the planet, the coconut crab. They're 3 feet long, they can carry at least 6 times their body weight, and they use their pincers that are as strong as a lion's jaw to rip open coconuts, which is their main source of food. But coconuts are not the only thing they eat. They'll also eat pigs, they'll eat each other, they'll even eat themselves. And they're prolific climbers because they need to get up to get to the coconuts. But in some parts of the world, they use their climbing ability to climb up and grab birds and break their wings with their pincers and then drag them into their underground burrows where they will eat them too. The few researchers and scientists that have gone out to Niku Maroro Island have said at night, thousands of these crabs will emerge from their underground burrows and they'll go looking for food. And they have a really keen sense of smell and they can smell blood. So when one of the crabs goes up and grabs a bird and starts ripping it apart, the thousands of others will come charging over and swarm the bird because they've smelled the blood, and they'll rip it to pieces and they'll all try to get in on the action. And so the theory goes, Earhart and Noonan are making their way to Howland Island. They get off track somehow and they wind up crash landing
350 miles away on Niku Mrballen Island on one of the reefs. Noonan probably dies on impact, and Earhart, who's badly wounded and probably bleeding, she gets onto the island and she makes her way up to that area where that campfire was found. And for some amount of time, Earhart is able to survive off of whatever she had on her in those glass bottles, but in her weakened state and bleeding, at some point she probably attracted the coconut crabs who one night came out and swarmed her, ripped her to pieces, and ate her. Today, Niku Mrballen Island is only inhabited by the coconut crabs and it's protected land under the Republic of Kiribati. And so if you want to go, you have to get express permission from the Republic of Kiribati, and they send someone to go with you. And there's no airport on the island, so you have to land on a separate island and then ride to Niku Mrballen on a boat, but you have to pass through Cyclone Alley, which means you can only travel there at certain parts of the year, and even then it's incredibly